The train platform was clean, not swept, not tidied up for inspection, clean, the way nothing in North Africa had ever been clean. Feldwebel Hans Weber stood on that platform in Oklahoma in the summer of 1943 and stared at concrete without a single oil stain, without a scrap of litter, without the fine grit of desert sand that had covered every surface he had touched for 2 years. He had surrendered 3 weeks earlier when the Afrika Korps collapsed in Tunisia. He expected a firing squad or a slow death in some forgotten camp. The Reich had spent 10 years telling him exactly what to expect from America. A nation eating itself alive, rationing so severe the population was starving. Factories grinding to a halt because the workers were too weak to stand at a machine. Then an American sergeant walked toward him carrying a clipboard, and Weber noticed something that made his stomach turn cold. The man was overweight, not gaunt, not desperate, overweight and visibly bored. Weber had not seen an overweight man in 4 years. He did not know it yet. But the 10 years of certainty he carried inside him were about to come apart. Not with violence, but with a bar of soap and a hot shower. And once that certainty broke, it would never come back together the same way again. I'm glad you're here today. What state are you watching from? Hans Weber had grown up on a small dairy farm outside a village in Bavaria. The kind of place where the biggest event of the year was the harvest festival and the loudest sound was a church bell. He had been drafted in 1939 at the age of 20, trained as an infantryman, and by 1941 he was a Feldwebel, a sergeant leading a squad through the sand and rock of the North African desert. He had fought at Tobruk. He had fought at El Alamein. He had watched his unit shrink over the course of 2 years as supply lines collapsed and reinforcements stopped arriving. The desert had a way of stripping a man down to almost nothing. The heat during the day was thick enough to press against a man's chest like a hand. The cold at night cut through even 2 blankets. Sand worked its way into rifle actions, into rations, into the seams of a man's skin until it felt permanent. By the spring of 1943, his men were eating 1 meal a day, sometimes nothing at all, chewing on hardtack that had turned to powder in their packs, and washing was a memory rather than a habit. Weber had stopped expecting to survive the war sometime around his 23rd birthday. He simply kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering what home smelled like. On the 13th of May, 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. Weber stood in a line with thousands of other German soldiers, watched British and American officers walk down the ranks, and waited to find out what would happen to him. He expected the worst. He had been told for a decade that the Western democracies were weak but cruel to their enemies, that captured German soldiers disappeared into camps from which no one returned. He did not believe he would survive the year. He was wrong, though it would take him months to understand exactly how wrong. After 3 weeks of processing in North African holding camps, Weber was marched onto a transport ship, one of the American Liberty ships built by the thousands to move men and cargo across the Atlantic. The crossing took 19 days. He spent most of it below deck with hundreds of other prisoners. Seasick, hungry, uncertain whether the ship's final destination was a labor camp or an execution ground. The hold smelled of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. Men slept in shifts on canvas cots, stacked 3 high. And at night the groan of the hull against the waves sounded to Weber like the whole ship might come apart before it ever reached land. He spent long hours simply staring at the curved steel ceiling above his cot, turning over the same question every soldier around him was asking in whispers. Was this mercy, or was it simply a longer road to the same ending? When they finally reached New York Harbor, Weber caught his first glimpse of the American skyline through a porthole. towers of steel and glass rising into a clear sky. Undamaged, unbumped, indifferent to the war consuming his continent. From New York, he was loaded onto a train heading west. The journey took days. Weber pressed his face to the window and watched a country pass by that made no sense to him. Cities lit at night, glowing without blackout curtains, farmland stretching to the horizon, worked by tractors instead of starving oxen, people on train platforms who looked well fed, unhurried, bored by the sight of a trainload of enemy prisoners passing through their town. Everything he saw contradicted what the propaganda ministry had spent a decade drilling into him. He had been told America was a nation eating itself alive, crippled by its own greed, incapable of sustaining a real war effort. The evidence outside his window told a different story, and he did not know what to do with that. The train stopped at Fort Reno, Oklahoma. In the summer of 1943, Weber stepped down onto a platform of clean concrete, no oil stain, no litter, none of the grit that had covered every surface in North Africa for 2 years. 30 yards away, American guards stood in pressed uniforms with polished boots. They did not look starving. They did not look desperate. They looked bored. The expression of men doing a routine job on an ordinary day. Weber had not seen a well-fed enemy soldier look bored in 4 years of war. It unsettled him more than hostility would have. An American sergeant walked toward the new arrivals carrying a clipboard, and Weber noticed something that struck him as almost impossible. The man was overweight, not merely healthy, overweight, with the soft build of someone who had never gone hungry. Weber had not seen an overweight man since before the war began. The sergeant called names from the clipboard. Each prisoner stepped forward and was directed toward a line of waiting trucks. When Weber's name was called, he climbed into a truck bed that was clean. No rust, no caked mud. The tires still showing full tread. He sat on a wooden bench beside a younger soldier, a Gefreiter named Ernst Hoffmann, who had been conscripted in 1941 at the age of 18 and had spent nearly 2 years fighting in the desert with dwindling equipment and rations. Hoffmann looked as stunned as Weber felt. The truck carried them 3 miles through farmland untouched by war. Wheat fields, stretching in every direction, cattle grazing in open pasture, no bomb craters, no burned villages, no columns of refugees walking along the roadside. It was a landscape that seemed to exist outside the war entirely. At the main compound, an American officer who spoke fluent German addressed the new prisoners. He explained that they were now prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. They would receive the same rations as American troops. They would have access to medical care, recreational facilities, and educational classes. Officers and senior non-commissioned officers would not be required to labor, though enlisted men could volunteer for paid work at 80 cents a day. Weber had braced himself for threats or humiliation. Instead, he was being told, calmly and matter-of-factly, that he would be fed the same food as his captors and paid for any work he chose to do. Processing took most of the afternoon. Photographs, fingerprints, a prisoner number stamped onto a card. Then came the clothing issue. 2 sets of surplus fatigues stenciled with the letters PW across the back. Shirts, socks, underwear, aquat, and boots that actually fit his feet. Weber had worn the same uniform for 7 weeks. The fabric had gone stiff with dried sweat and salt, rotting at the seams. And he had stuffed the holes in his boots with strips torn from his blanket to keep the sand out. Now he was holding clean clothing that smelled faintly of soap, a smell he had almost forgotten. The barracks were long wooden buildings with pitched roofs, rows of bunks inside, each one made up with a mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow. At the far end stood a latrine unlike anything Weber had seen in the field. 4 porcelain toilets with seats, 4 sinks with running water, and 4 shower heads mounted above a tiled, drained floor. He turned a tap and water came out warm, then hot. He had not felt hot running water since leaving Germany a year and a half earlier. Hoffman came to stand beside him, staring at the shower heads as if they might vanish. He asked quietly whether any of this was real. Weber had no answer, because he did not know either. A guard entered and announced in halting German that dinner would be served within the half hour and that they were free to wash first. Nobody moved for several seconds after he left. Then one prisoner walked to the shower, stripped off his filthy uniform, and stepped under the spray. Steam rose. He stood there with his eyes closed, water running down a face that had not been properly cleaned in months. Within minutes, all 4 showers were occupied, men queuing for their turn. When it was Weber's turn, the water was hot enough to redden his skin, and he found an actual bar of soap on the shelf. Not the gritty substitute the army had issued in the desert. He worked it through his hair and scrubbed at skin that had not been properly washed since Tunisia. The water pooling at his feet ran brown with dirt and dried salt. He stayed under the spray far longer than he should have, until the men waiting behind him forced him to surrender his place. He dressed in the clean uniform, the fabric soft and strange against skin that remembered only stiff, sweat-crusted cloth, and walked with the others to the mess hall. Trays were filled at a serving line, section by section, by American soldiers who did not sneer or hesitate. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, a fresh roll with real butter, a slice of apple pie with a flaky crust. Weber stared at the tray for a long moment before he began to eat. He could not remember the last time he had seen this much food on a single plate. When a guard told them seconds were available, he went back through the line without hesitation. And so did Hoffman, who leaned across the table afterward and said quietly that this was more food than he had eaten in 3 days back in Tunisia. That night Weber lay on a real mattress under warm blankets and listened to other prisoners arguing in the dark. Some were certain this comfort was temporary, that the real camp, the hard camp, was still waiting somewhere down the line. Others believed it was a trick designed to make them write cheerful letters home and demoralize the German public. A guard tower stood visible through the window, its searchlight sweeping the compound at slow, regular intervals, and each pass threw a brief bar of light across the ceiling above Weber's bunk. He watched it come and go, and found the rhythm strangely calming. After years of sleeping with one ear, listening for artillery, Weber said nothing to the men arguing around him. He stared at the ceiling and thought about 10 years of certainty, about everything he had been taught concerning the strength of his own nation and the weakness of this one, about the clean platform and the overweight sergeant and the bar of soap that had smelled like nothing he remembered from home. He understood, without wanting to, that something inside that certainty had already begun to crack, and that no amount of arguing in the dark would put it back together the way it had been that morning. The days at Fort Reno settled quickly into a rhythm Weber had not known since before the war. Wake at 6 in the morning, shower, breakfast at 7, eggs and bacon and toast and real coffee instead of the bitter ersatz brew the Wehrmacht had issued for years. After breakfast, enlisted men could sign up for labor details on nearby farms and ranches, work that paid 80 cents a day and could be spent at the camp canteen on cigarettes, chocolate, and writing paper. Officers and senior sergeants like Weber were not required to work, but Weber volunteered anyway. Sitting idle in a barracks all day felt worse than labor, and the work gave his hands something to do besides remember. In the evenings, The compound had a recreation building where prisoners gathered to play cards, listen to a phonograph playing German records, or read from a shelf of German language books donated through the Red Cross. There was a small chapel where a German prisoner who had once studied for the priesthood led Sunday services, and a bulletin board near the entrance listing upcoming religious services, sports matches between barracks teams, and the schedule for educational classes. A guard usually sat in the corner of the recreation room reading a newspaper, present but rarely interfering. And in the evenings, the sound of a soccer match outside the windows, prisoners shouting good-natured insults at each other in German, was as close to ordinary life as Weber had felt in years. His first detail was baling hay on a farm 15 miles from camp. The labor was hard under the Oklahoma sun, but nothing like the desert. They worked from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon with an hour for lunch. And the farmer who owned the land walked the fields with them, showing the prisoners how to stack the bales efficiently, bringing water to the field every hour without being asked. On the third day, he asked Weber if he knew how to drive a tractor. Weber, who had grown up around farm machinery in Bavaria, said he did. And for the following 2 weeks, he drove the tractor pulling the hay wagon while the others loaded behind him. The engine's steady rattle, a strange comfort after years of listening for the whine of approaching aircraft. The Oklahoma heat in June was heavy and wet, in a way the desert heat had never been, and by mid-afternoon Weber's shirt clung to his back with sweat. But it was an honest kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from labor rather than fear, and he found he did not mind it. Ernst Hoffmann, the young Gefreiter Weber, had met on the truck ride from the train platform, was assigned to a different detail, cutting timber near a lake several miles from camp. He came back each evening tired but well-fed, describing sandwiches and fruit and coffee handed out at midday, and on Saturdays, ice cream, an experience Hoffmann described with something close to reverence. He told Weber he had not tasted ice cream since before the war began, and he said it the way another man might describe seeing his mother again. Hoffmann had been barely 18 when he was conscripted, pulled out of a trade apprenticeship and handed a rifle before he had finished growing into his own shoulders, and 2 years in the desert had aged him in ways that showed most clearly in his eyes rather than his face. At night he sometimes talked in his sleep, short fragments of orders and place names from battles. Neither of them wanted to discuss awake. Weber had come to think of him less as a fellow prisoner and more as a younger brother he had inherited by accident. Someone worth watching over in a place where neither of them fully understood the rules anymore. By midsummer, Weber had gained 12 pounds. His uniform from Tunisia no longer fit around the shoulders, and the camp issued him a larger size. He was not alone. Men who had arrived from North Africa gaunt and hollow-eyed were filling out week by week. The camp physician who examined each prisoner monthly told Weber in June that his blood pressure was normal, that there were no signs of the parasites or malnutrition that had plagued him in the desert, and that he was, by every clinical measure, healthier as a prisoner in Oklahoma than he had been as a free soldier in the Africa Corps. Weber absorbed this information the way a man absorbs a diagnosis he does not want but cannot argue with. He had spent years being told that the German soldier represented the physical peak of a superior people hardened by discipline and racial destiny, while the enemy grew soft and weak on decadence. Standing in front of a mirror in the barracks washroom, watching color return to a face that had been gray and hollow for 2 years, he could no longer square that story with the body looking back at him. The stronger and healthier he became in American captivity, the harder it grew to believe anything the recruiting posters back home had promised him. On the 12th of June, Weber was assigned to a new detail, this one at a cattle ranch belonging to a man named Robert Mitchell. Mitchell was 63 years old, too old to be drafted himself. though he had 2 sons serving overseas. He drove out to the camp each morning in a pickup truck to collect the work crew and drove them 22 miles west to his land, a spread of roughly 3,400 acres running cattle and wheat. Mitchell had lost most of his hired hands to the draft or to better paying factory work in the cities, and the labor of German prisoners was, by his own admission, the only thing keeping his operation running. Weber had grown up around cattle and fences, and the work came naturally to him. Mitchell worked alongside the prisoners, rather than simply directing them, mending fence line, moving cattle between pastures, showing them where the ground gave way to soft spots that could break a horse's leg if a rider was not careful. He shared his lunch without being asked, sitting in the shade of a truck bed and passing around a jar of water and whatever his wife had packed that morning. On the second day, Mitchell's wife invited the entire crew into the farmhouse for lunch instead of eating out in the field. She served pot roast, boiled potatoes, carottes, fresh bread, and sweet iced tea, setting the table as though for guests rather than enemy prisoners under armed watch. After the meal, she brought out pie and coffee, refilling cups without being asked. She wore an apron dusted with flour and moved around the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had fed hired hands at that same table for 20 years. And she asked Weber, in plain, unaccented English, where in Germany he was from, listening with genuine interest when he described the hills around his family's farm. Weber sat at that table, a captured German soldier, eating a meal cooked by an American woman whose 2 sons were at that very moment fighting against his country somewhere in Europe, and felt something shift in him that he could not immediately name. It was not gratitude alone, though gratitude was part of it. It was the slow, uncomfortable recognition that decency was not something Mitchell's family performed because guards were present, or because propaganda required it, or because some official policy demanded courtesy toward prisoners. It was simply how they treated people. Weber turned this thought over for the rest of the day as he worked the fence line and found that once it had entered his mind, he could not force it back out. Mitchell drove the crew back to camp that evening and told them, as he did every evening, that he would see them tomorrow. Weber returned to his bunk and lay there while Hoffman asked how the ranch work had gone. Weber said only that it was fine. He did not mention the lunch. He did not yet have the words to explain what that lunch had revealed, that everything the propaganda ministry had told him about the character of the enemy was, as far as he could tell, entirely wrong. Over the following 2 months, Weber worked at Mitchell's ranch 5 days a week. He mended fences, herded cattle between summer pastures, and helped bring in the wheat harvest when the time came. Mitchell paid the standard 80 cents a day. But he also provided extras that were not required of him. Cold drinks on the hottest afternoons, fresh vegetables from his wife's garden, tomatoes and squash and sweet corn handed to the prisoners to take back to camp. Small things. But Weber had learned by then that small things carried enormous weight when a man had spent 2 years with almost nothing. On the 4th of July, Mitchell invited the entire work crew to his house for a barbecue. He grilled steaks over an open fire while his wife prepared potato salad and corn on the cob, and the prisoners ate on the porch as the sun went down, watching fireworks bloom over the town of Reno in the distance. Mitchell talked unprompted about his sons. The older one was training with Patton's 7th Army in North Africa, waiting to find out where the next landing would take him. The younger one was training in England, preparing for whatever invasion of France was coming. Mitchell did not speak with hatred toward the men sitting on his porch. He spoke the way any father would, worried and proud in equal measure, hoping his boys would come home in one piece. He pulled a worn photograph from his shirt pocket at one point, 2 young men in uniform, squinting into the sun outside this very farmhouse. and passed it around the porch without hesitation, letting German prisoners hold a photograph of the American soldiers he loved most in the world. Weber studied the picture for a long moment before handing it back, struck by how ordinary the two young men looked, no different in the face. From soldiers he had served beside in Africa, Weber asked him carefully, in the broken English he was beginning to learn, whether it bothered him to have German prisoners working his land while his own sons fought Germans overseas. Mitchell considered the question for a long moment before answering. He said the prisoners had not started the war any more than his own sons had. He said they were all of them, German and American alike, caught up in something larger than themselves, and that he hoped when it was finally over, people could go back to being people instead of being enemies. Weber did not have a response to that. He sat with the words for the rest of the evening, watching fireworks over a town that had never once been bombed, and said nothing. In August, the camp began offering English classes twice a week, taught by a volunteer school teacher from Oklahoma City. Weber enrolled immediately. He wanted to understand what was being said around him without waiting for a translator to relay it secondhand. He studied grammar and vocabulary with the same discipline he had once applied to infantry drills. And by September, he could hold a simple conversation. He practiced on the guards, most of whom were friendly enough once they realized he was trying. They asked him about Germany, about what life had been like before the war. And Weber told them about Bavaria, about the mountains and the dairy farms and the small villages where nothing much ever happened. In turn, the guards told him about Oklahoma, about the dust storms of the previous decade that had driven whole families from their land, about the oil derricks that had briefly made some men rich, about wheat fields that seemed to run on forever in every direction. They spoke to each other, not as captor and prisoner, but simply as two men killing time with conversation. One guard, a young private from Tulsa, barely older than Hoffman, admitted one evening that he had never expected to spend the war standing watch over German farmers and mechanics rather than fighting overseas, and that most days the job felt less like guarding dangerous enemies and more like supervising a very large, very foreign work crew. Weber found he agreed, though he kept that thought mostly to himself. In October, Weber was transferred to a different assignment, loading ice at a railroad plant that supplied refrigerated cars for shipping perishable goods. The work was cold and repetitive, 8 hours a day, hauling blocks of ice under wagons. But the plant manager treated the prisoners fairly, allowing warm breaks every 2 hours and making certain each man had proper gloves to prevent frostbite. Weber worked through the early winter at the ice plant, his hands cracked and raw from the cold, but his body stronger and steadier than it had been in years. The plant sat beside the railroad tracks, and twice a day Weber watched long freight trains rumble past loaded with wheat and cattle and crates bound for cities he had never seen. An endless procession of goods moving across a country that showed no visible sign of wartime scarcity. He thought often, standing in the cold with a block of ice balanced on a hook, of the propaganda films he had watched as a younger man, newsreels describing an America crippled by rationing and industrial collapse. Nothing he had witnessed in 18 months of captivity matched a single frame of those films. On the 16th of December, 1944, news reached the camp of a massive German offensive launched through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. For a few days, some of the prisoners were elated, convinced this was the turn they had been waiting for, proof that Germany still had the strength to win. Weber did not share their excitement. He had seen enough of the war's mathematics by then to recognize desperation dressed up as strategy. A nation that still believed it could win did not need to gamble everything on a single offensive through frozen forest terrain in the dead of winter. He kept this opinion largely to himself, aware that saying it aloud would not be welcome in a barrack still clinging to hope. Hoffman, in particular, spent those first days after the news arrived talking eagerly about the possibility of the war turning, about German tanks reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies apart, the way they had split French defenses in 1940. Weber listened without arguing. He understood the pull of that hope better than he wanted to admit. It would have been easier, in many ways, to believe the war might still be won. Easier than sitting with the alternative that everything he had once fought for was already finished and had perhaps been finished for a very long time. The offensive collapsed within weeks, as Weber had quietly expected. By late January, the news arriving at camp made the outcome plain, even to the most hopeful among the prisoners. The Red Army was advancing on Berlin from the east. American and British forces were pushing toward the Rhine from the west. It was no longer a question of whether Germany would be defeated, only how much longer it would take and how much would be left standing when it was over. Weber tried not to dwell on what might be happening to his own family. He had received no letters since 1943. More than a year without word of his mother, his father, his younger brother. He did not know if his village still stood or if it had been reduced to rubble, like so many towns he had read about in the camp newspaper. Rather than sit with that uncertainty, he focused on the routine that had carried him through the past year and a half. Work, meals, sleep, English lessons twice a week. It was a narrow way to live, but it kept the fear at a manageable distance. On the 30th of April, 1945, word reached the camp that Hitler was dead. On the 7th of May, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The camp commandant called a formation to inform the prisoners officially. He explained through an interpreter that they would remain in American custody until arrangements could be made for repatriation, and that this might take months, possibly longer. Germany itself was in chaos. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of displaced people were moving across a landscape with no functioning government, no intact railways, no reliable food supply. The Allied powers needed time to establish order before prisoners could safely be returned. Weber listened to this news with a strange, hollow calm. He had nowhere urgent to return to, even if the ships had been ready that same afternoon. He did not know if there was a home left to go back to. Around him, the reaction in the barracks was divided. Some prisoners wept openly, mourning a nation and a cause they had believed in without question. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing, the same expression Weber had seen on men in the desert after a battle that could not be won by any remaining effort. A few, quietly, admitted relief, though none said so above a whisper, aware of how such a sentiment would sound to men who had lost brothers and fathers to the cause now officially declared finished. Robert Mitchell asked him, not long after, whether he wanted to keep working the ranch despite the war's end. Weber said yes, without hesitation. The cattle did not care that Germany had surrendered. Fences still sagged and needed mending. Wheat still needed harvesting in its season. Through the summer and fall of 1945, Weber continued reporting to Mitchell's ranch 5 days a week, doing the same steady work he had done for over a year. Work that had become, without his fully noticing, something closer to a life than a sentence. In November, Mitchell made him an offer that Weber had not expected. He said that when repatriation eventually came, Weber could return to Oklahoma afterward if he chose to. Mitchell would sponsor him, help him navigate whatever paperwork the process required. It was, Weber understood, an offer of something rare, a door left open on the other side of a war that had tried its hardest to close every door a man like him might have hoped to walk through. Weber told him he would think about it, and he did think about it, turning the offer over for the better part of 2 weeks, while he mended fences and moved cattle and watched the Oklahoma sky change with the season. In the end, he told Mitchell no, not permanently, only for now. He needed to return to Germany first. He needed to find out whether his mother was alive, whether his brother had survived the Eastern Front, whether the farm outside his village still stood, or whether it too had been swallowed by the war. Mitchell nodded and said the offer would still be there if Weber ever changed his mind, shaking his hand at the end of that conversation the way he might shake the hand of any hired man finishing a season's work. Not a defeated enemy soldier being released back into an uncertain world, repatriation finally began in January of 1946. Prisoners processed in groups and shipped back across the Atlantic in the reverse of the journey that had brought them to America nearly 3 years earlier. Weber's group was scheduled to depart in early March. In the days before he left, he walked the fence lines at Mitchell's ranch one last time, said goodbye to guards he had come to know by name, and packed the few belongings a prisoner of war was permitted to carry home, including, folded carefully at the bottom of his bag, a small bar of American soap he had saved rather than used, a strange keepsake for a man about to cross an ocean, but one that felt, to Weber, like evidence he might need someday to prove to himself that any of this had actually happened. Weber's group departed Fort Reno by train in early March of 1946, retracing in reverse the same route that had carried him into America nearly 3 years earlier, from Oklahoma to a port on the eastern seaboard, then aboard a transport ship bound for Bremen. The crossing took 11 days. Weber spent much of it on deck rather than below, watching the gray Atlantic swell and fall, thinking less about what he was returning to than about what he was leaving behind. He stood at the rail as the ship approached the German coast and saw the destruction before the harbor was even fully in view. Bremen was ruins. Entire blocks reduced to broken walls and open foundations, the harbor choked with the sunken hulls of ships that had never made it out before. The bombing campaigns intensified. Weber had read about the bombing of German cities in camp newspapers, brief and censored accounts, but nothing had prepared him for the scale of it laid out in front of him. Mile after mile of a city that no longer functioned as a city, they disembarked and were processed through a transit camp run by British occupation authorities. Weber was issued travel documents and a small amount of money and told simply that he was free to go. After 33 months as a prisoner of war, freedom arrived without ceremony. A stamped piece of paper and a train ticket south. The journey to Bavaria that should have taken a single day took 4. The rail network was in ruins. Bridges had been destroyed and not yet rebuilt. Entire stations existed only as piles of brick with a platform sign still standing, absurdly intact, among the wreckage. Weber changed trains repeatedly, walked sections of track that had no working service at all, and slept in stations alongside other returning soldiers and displaced civilians, all of them moving toward homes they were not certain still existed. He reached his village on the 21st of March, 1946. Half the buildings he remembered were gone, collapsed or burned, and the streets he had walked as a boy were unfamiliar in their emptiness. His family's farm was still standing, though the barn had been burned at some point during the war's final chaotic months. The reason unclear even to the neighbors who had stayed behind. His mother was alive. She met him at the door of the farmhouse and did not recognize him for several seconds. Not until he spoke, and then she began to cry in a way that told Weber immediately that the news waiting for him was not going to be entirely good. His father had died in an air raid in 1944, killed instantly when a stray bomb meant for a rail junction 3 kilometers away landed on the edge of the village. Instead, His younger brother, drafted late in the war at just 17, had been killed on the Eastern Front sometime in early 1945. One name among millions lost in the war's final collapse. With no grave that the family had ever been able to locate, Weber sat with his mother that first night in a kitchen, lit by a single oil lamp, electricity in the village not yet restored, and found himself describing Fort Reno in careful, halting detail. The clean barracks, the showers with hot running water, the meals of fried chicken and apple pie, Robert Mitchell's ranch and the pot roast his wife had served at her own dining table to a captured enemy soldier. His mother listened with an expression Weber could not immediately read, and when he finished, she asked quietly whether he thought he was exaggerating, whether the years away had perhaps softened his memory of captivity into something kinder than it had actually been. Weber told her no. He told her it had all been real, every detail of it, and that the strangest part was not the comfort itself, but what the comfort had done to him. He explained that he had spent years believing Germany represented civilization at its highest point, that other nations, particularly America, were weak and degenerate by comparison, destined to collapse under the weight of their own decadence. Then he had been captured and had spent 2.5 years living better, eating better, and being treated with more basic decency than he had experienced in the German army itself. Not because his captors were trying to convert him to their way of thinking, but simply because decent treatment of prisoners was, for them, the ordinary baseline rather than an exception. His mother did not respond to this directly. She only reached across the table and took his hand the way she had when he was a boy frightened by a thunderstorm. And Weber understood that some of what he was describing was simply too large for either of them to fully absorb in a single conversation, on a single night, in a kitchen lit by one flickering oil lamp in a country still learning to count its dead. Weber spent the rest of 1946 and into 1947 working what remained of his mother's farm. Germany in those years was a country of genuine hunger, worse in some districts than anything the propaganda ministry had ever falsely claimed about wartime America. Official rations were inadequate to sustain a working adult, and most families survived only through the black market or through favors traded among neighbors who had once been strangers. Weber found himself more than once remembering specific meals from Fort Reno with an intensity that embarrassed him. The fried chicken, the apple pie, the ice cream Hoffman had loved on Saturday afternoon. Foods that had been ordinary rations for prisoners of war and were now in his own liberated homeland. Distant luxuries he could not have obtained with any amount of money. He had, in the strict sense of daily nutrition, eaten better as a captured enemy in Oklahoma than he now ate as a free man in his own country. In July of 1947, Weber made a decision he had been circling for months without quite admitting it to himself. He wrote a letter to Robert Mitchell, care of the ranch address he had memorized before leaving Oklahoma, asking whether the offer of sponsorship was still open. Mitchell wrote back within a matter of weeks. His answer, simple and unchanged. The offer stood. He enclosed the paperwork. Weber would need to begin the immigration process. The process itself took 8 months, a slow crawl through consular offices and displaced persons paperwork in a Germany still rebuilding its most basic administrative functions. In March of 1948, Weber boarded a ship in Bremen bound for New York, the same harbor city where he had first glimpsed America through a porthole 5 years earlier as a captured soldier, uncertain whether he was being carried toward mercy or execution. This time he stood on deck as the ship arrived, watching the skyline rise out of the harbor haze, and felt something closer to arrival than dread. He reached New York on the 7th of April and took a train to Oklahoma City, retracing, in far better circumstances, the same route he had traveled as a prisoner. Robert Mitchell was waiting at the station when the train pulled in, older now, his hair more gray than Weber remembered, but his handshake exactly as firm as it had been on the ranch 3 years before. They drove together back to the property, past fence lines. Weber had once mended as a captive past pastures where he had once herded cattle for 80 cents a day. And Mitchell showed him to a small house on the edge of the land, modest but complete, with running water, electricity, and a bathroom containing a real toilet and a shower. The same simple comforts that had once broken something open inside him on his first afternoon at Fort Reno. Weber worked Mitchell's ranch for the next 34 years. He learned to speak English fluently. The halting classroom German phrases of 1944 eventually giving way to an easy, unaccented fluency that made strangers assume he had lived in Oklahoma his entire life. He became an American citizen in 1953, taking the oath in a courthouse in El Reno with a small group of other immigrants, none of whom, as far as he knew, had arrived by way of a prisoner of war camp. In 1956, he married a schoolteacher from El Reno, and together they raised 3 children on land. Weber had first come to know while wearing a uniform stenciled with the letters that marked him as an enemy. Robert Mitchell died in 1974. His sons kept Weber on afterward, and he continued working the land until 1982, when he finally retired from the daily labor of ranch work. In the years that followed, Weber occasionally spoke at local schools and civic gatherings about his experiences, always returning to the same central point whenever he told the story. He said he had arrived in Oklahoma as a young sergeant expecting brutality, prepared by a decade of propaganda to believe the worst about the people who had captured him, and had instead found ordinary human decency in a place he had been told contained none. He said that discovery had changed everything about how he understood the world, more thoroughly and more permanently than any battle he had survived in North Africa. Hans Weber died in 1997 at the age of 78. Having spent more than half his life in the country whose strength and decency he had once been taught with absolute certainty did not exist. What broke that certainty was not a battle or a bomb or a single dramatic confrontation. It was a clean train platform, a bored American sergeant who happened to be overweight, and a bar of soap in a shower at Fort Reno. Small things that together proved larger and more durable than 10 years of lies ever could. Outlasting the war itself and outlasting the regime that had told those lies in the first place, carried quietly by one former enemy soldier for the rest of his long American life,